Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe here with me, my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And today we've got a continuation to our Riddle of Steel podcast. This time around we'll be continuing from our last discussion where we discussed the madness of King Borna's actions when he had proclaimed that he had saved his children from growing up to be further disappointments to him, which is a pretty evil thing to say. Then again, he did something very evil, which Taligaro himself commented, "This is madness, sire." At which point he is accused of wanting the throne for himself, which is actually true, right before he's punched in the face and knocked to the ground by King Borna. So, right there, that establishes Borna as not being a very nice guy, and the sort of employer who's not going to let you walk away with your 401k and your retirement fund and, your insurance intact, or even your life for that matter. On the other hand, who should arrive but Hercules? I mean, Kull. Oh, come on. Everybody's cracked the Hercules jokes in regards to Sorbo and his performance as Kull because he was so memorable as Hercules. Although his performance as Kull is nothing like that of Hercules. It's still really great. It's just the way he does Kull, it is nothing like the Hercules portrayal. His Hercules is heroic and noble and chivalrous. Kull is quite a bit different from Herc. He's a lost soul in a similar way, but also not. Now, Kull arrives on the scene just as Borna is preparing to put an end to Taligaro. And Kull decides to intervene. It really seems like in this scene when Borna accuses Taligaro of wanting his throne that they should have included the Snake Men as part of the story. As Borna's paranoia, there seems to be something there. And for him to for there not to be anything there doesn't make much sense. Now, I'm not sure how the Dark Horse miniseries handled this side of Borna, but I can say that from what it's implied in the short stories by Howard, Borna did become a tyrant and did become fairly paranoid, and it may have had something to do with the Shadow Kingdom beneath the kingdom, so to speak, and that Borna was driven insane, always watching his back and fearing those who kind of helped him claim the throne, which Borna knew, however, that going back 1,000 years, that perhaps even beyond, that the Snake Men had been killing and enslaving the souls of the kings of Alesia, and could have only have suspected that, well, he must have known for sure, actually, that they would likely do the same thing to him in a heartbeat, which is pretty horrible to think about. But it was a fate that Borna had kind of brought upon himself by agreeing to become their puppet. That said, in the movie, this is not the case. And he's simply gone cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, which I'm not saying he wasn't in the short stories and whatnot, just that there was different context to it to an extent. Although that said, he was still evil, by all means. Now, when Borna goes to deal the killing blow to Taligaro, which would probably have saved everyone a lot of trouble in this movie, ironically enough, Kull steps in and tells Borna there will be no more bloodshed tonight, unless it's to be your own. Telling Borna in no uncertain terms, okay, you've killed your sons, that's enough. If there's anyone who's going to die, it's going to be you for your sins. And this is a powerful indictment and condemnation of Borna's actions. With Kull, in a way, behaving as the proper king archetype should, proclaiming that has been spilled, tragedy wrought, and that it is the king's responsibility to, as the ultimate justiciar of the realm, to see justice meted out and not to tolerate injustice and tyranny. So, Borna, as the Shadow King, the sadist, is disgusted and angered by this and pushes Kull away and shouts, "Treason!" And thus begins a very, very important duel. In the original stories, Kull had rallied an army and then marched on the capital. He was one of many claimants, and he was the last man standing. And the last one to really, who was a possible choice as a monarch. On the other hand, he was also, I think, the first one to Borna. Here, he's not so much a leader of an army already. And so they had to fast forward through the mercenary phase and the captain of some sort of guards phase straight to essentially kingship in this movie. But that ultimately you get the general gist of Kull's career, what it's been like so far. Though the script could have probably stood to explore his mercenary days a little more, sadly they didn't. And this is a matter that they likely should have dealt with. That said, given the time and budgetary constraints they had, they did pretty good. And the fight that ensues is a pretty good one, with Borna proving himself to be a much better fighter than, say, King Numidides was, and in all honesty, perhaps a better fighter than some of the villains faced in the Conan movies, and ultimately one of the most intriguing characters in some ways. And I know people may not think that Borna is very intriguing, but I think there's a lot to ponder about the character. And the comic book miniseries did a good job fleshing the character out a little, and his relationship with Igraine, his daughter, who became Kull's wife. As that's a very fascinating idea, that Kull might have become, well, the man's son-in-law, if after the man's death. Which maybe they should have gone with that kind of idea in the Kull movie, rather than just some random floozy that knows how to read some tarot cards. As the love interest in this movie isn't exactly gripping or interesting. And they should have probably stuck with Brohl rather than the priest character that they did have. And it's just that the miniseries comic book run of Dark Horse had a better support cast to an extent. Though, this is not to say that the priest actor did a bad job, per se. He's actually a pretty good actor, and his character is pretty interesting. He could have been part of the cast. I'm just arguing in favor of also including Brohl, Kull's sworn brother. That aside, Borna puts up a pretty darn good fight. On the other hand, it's easy to read into the situation that Kull is reluctant to fight Borna, because, it might get awkward if you do end up killing your boss. It's not the sort of thing that's conducive to a healthy workplace environment. I mean, if you just up and started and murdered your boss, even if it was in self-defense, I mean, no offense, Dan, but I think there'd be a few questions and there'd be some complaints filed about it.
No kidding. I mean, I get this is a difficult situation. Borna just murdered all of his sons.
Which, I have to ask, do you think that's high treason on the king's part? Because then we're pulling into question, do people swear oaths to the king as a person or to the office of kingship?
Which that's probably why all of the courtiers, all of the even many in the army are wondering what do they do. The king went mad and slew all his sons.
Yeah. Thankfully, Nous les Français around 1789 and the English around 1650 decided, each respectively, that maybe the oaths are technically to the man sitting on the chair, not the man himself. Because what do you do when the king is guilty of high treason? In the case of Charles, you have him rewriting the prayer books. In the case of Louis XVI, you have him betraying France and serving the interests of Austria against his own countrymen, and basically oppressing his people and doing nothing to improve life for them. So, or even doing anything for them, considering his wild parties and nonsense. So, in both cases, the subjects were justified in wanting to do away with their monarchs. One had become a little vain, the other had become a traitor in the truest sense of the word. Although I'd argue in some ways Charles deserved his final fate less, because he did express regret. Louis only expressed regret that he was caught. And I know people may disagree with me, but I like Louis far less. He was just a sniveling worm, where Charles at least had the dignity to die with his head held high, and at least look his subjects in the eye and say, well, I stand by what I believe in, and that, the rule of law. We don't agree on the rule of law. We'll have to agree to disagree, but I'm going to my grave thinking I'm right. Whereas Louis, yeah, you can't fix spinelessness in his case. In Borna's case, he's so cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, he may as well be I can't talk today. May as well be Tarquin, yes, Superbius from Roman mythological history, because he's just not cooperating. So when Kull finally does him in, mortally wounds him out of self-defense, this is an act of desperation and, as said, self-defense. Because what was Kull supposed to do? At this point, the king is guilty of high treason. He killed the princes of several princes of royal blood. This is not a crime that can just be written off. There has to be consequences for this, even if he's a king. But on the other hand, he is the sitting monarch of an entire empire. What do you do? There's no other claimant, except maybe an incompetent cousin who doesn't deserve the throne, and nobody likes or wants on the throne. So, and maybe General Taligaro, but Taligaro is a wastrel as well. So, what do you do? This is an impossible scenario for the Empire. And it's one to an extent without a proper answer. Now, in the comic book, on another level, there's also the problem that the king had said, now I spare your life, mid-battle, when he realized he could not beat Kull, and Kull agreed to lower his sword with the mere admonishment of having bared steel in front of the monarch. Technically, Borna had offered his royal pardon, only for him to then try to kill Kull, which this is very dishonorable, unchivalrous behavior. By any stretch of the imagination in the ancient or medieval world, this is removing in some ways the sanctity of his kingship, because he's showing himself to be fickle, tyrannical, and ultimately untrustworthy. Because if he's willing to break his royal pardon like that on the flip of a coin, he's no longer worthy of the kingship.
And royals across, for example, if this was done in Europe, royals across Europe would hear about it, and it would have repercussions for that nation.
Now, on the other hand, there are very few monarchs that equal the Volusian emperor. And the thing is, Volusia is more like Rome, which there was no other king or sort of figure like that. So we have to compare it in a way to Caligula. But on the other hand, how did the Roman upper classes and some of the middle classes react to this sort of behavior by Caligula, or Claudius, or Nero, or Domitian, or Commodus? They didn't much like it. It's why there were assassination attempts against them, because they were not worthy of their positions. They were fickle tyrants. And so Borna is acting like that, and so this is not going to warm him up to his subjects or to anyone who, has an ounce of honor in their hearts. So Borna is just kind of lost what little claim he had to the throne with that one act, at least from a position of chivalry, where chivalry is concerned. That being said, archetypally he showed what kind of king he is. He's a shadow king. There's not an ounce of decency or goodness in him. On Kull's end, he saw through the trick and obviously was able to put an end to Borna, even though he was acting on instinct. So this is a very interesting action, but it's one that shows the good king killing the bad king. In a way, this is Kull rising to the occasion of kingship as he's supposed to. Kull, typically, as the king archetype, is portrayed as more the insecure king. Borna is also the insecure king, but he's turned into the sadistic king. Kull, as the insecure shadow, in a way, of the king in his fullness, that is, say, Conan the Cimmerian or Aragorn, is a king who's struggling to rise to the fullness of kingship. But ultimately he broods and is insecure. But like King Theoden, no matter what, we all know that when the time comes, will Kull rise to the occasion? Yes, he will. He's no Borna who could never rise to the occasion. But it's also interesting that he took the sword of a regular guard. But anyways, I don't think there's much more to be said about this scene.
No.
And the next few minutes deserve their own video. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Kull taking out a snake man.